It was the kind of antique shop that had too many corners, too many dusty shelves, and the faint smell of something old and forgotten. The kind of place you could spend hours in, just wandering, lost in the clutter of centuries-old relics, books that seemed to have never been opened, and oddities that had no business being sold. When Elena first stepped inside, she wasn't sure why she was drawn to it. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just a day out, a few hours to clear her head after a week of back-to-back work. She had no intention of buying anything, but there was something about the atmosphere in that shop, a strange pull she couldn't quite resist. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with sharp, knowing eyes, didn't say much as she walked through the aisles, letting her explore in silence. It was almost as if he were waiting for something to catch her eye. Elena wasn't sure what it was, but eventually, she found herself standing in front of a large, ornate mirror. It was beautiful in a way that unsettled her. The frame was dark wood, intricately carved with designs of roses and thorns, as if nature itself had been trapped within it. The glass wasn't perfectly clear, but the slight distortion only added to its mystique. It had the feel of an artifact, something old, something powerful, and something not quite right. The reflection in the mirror was oddly still, as if it were holding its breath. Elena reached out, running her fingers lightly over the surface, and when she did, the room seemed to fall silent. The faint hum of distant traffic, the shopkeeper's movements in the background, everything just seemed to fade away for a moment. She shook her head, dismissing the strange sensation, but still, she couldn't pull herself away from the mirror. It was like it had a grip on her, drawing her in. After a long moment of staring at her own reflection, Elena finally spoke up. "How much is it?" Her voice sounded small, as if the question itself felt wrong. The shopkeeper appeared behind her, so quietly that Elena hadn't even heard him approach. His eyes locked onto the mirror before he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "That one is not for everyone," he said, his gaze distant as if he were remembering something long buried. Elena turned to look at him, but before she could ask what he meant, he was already walking away, leaving her alone with the mirror. The price tag, a small slip of paper at the bottom, seemed to shimmer slightly under the dim lights. It wasn't expensive, not really, but something about it felt like a bargain. Without fully understanding why, Elena found herself pulling out her wallet and making the purchase. By the time she arrived home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the apartment in the kind of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Elena set the mirror down against the far wall, a place she figured it would be safe, but the moment it touched the floor, she had a strange feeling wash over her, a sense of unease, as if the room had changed. The mirror was much larger than she anticipated, and as she turned to face it, Elena felt a flicker of discomfort. It was too tall for the space, too heavy for the wall. But that feeling passed, and with a deep breath, she dismissed it. She didn't want to overthink it. Her reflection at first seemed normal. She looked tired, exhausted, really, after a long day. But as she stood there, staring at herself, something shifted. The reflection of her bedroom in the mirror looked different. The room in the glass was dimmer, colder, as though the lights had been turned off. But the strangest thing wasn't the lighting, it was the figure in the mirror. It wasn't her. A shadowy figure stood in the far corner of the room, just behind her, its shape barely visible, as though it were made of smoke. It wasn't in her real room, just the reflection. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she looked, the corner was empty. Shaking her head, she forced herself to take a step forward. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, clearer this time, its face now visible. A woman. Her hair was dark, unkempt, hanging in tangled strands around her pale face. Her eyes were wide open, empty and hollow, as if she were staring into Elena's soul. Elena stepped back, nearly tripping over the edge of her rug. Her reflection, still frozen in place, seemed to blink at her, its eyes slowly narrowing. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Elena whispered to herself, forcing a laugh, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. She reached out again, this time with trembling fingers, and the figure in the mirror stepped forward, as though it were mimicking her movement. This wasn't real, couldn't be, but when Elena turned to walk away, she saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving just out of sight behind her. It was so quick that she thought she might have imagined it. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she quickly shut the bedroom door, backing away, feeling a strange shiver run through her spine. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. The figure in the glass wasn't just a trick of light. It was alive. She couldn't explain why, but she felt compelled to keep watching. She needed to know if the shadowy figure would move again, if the mirror would change. She was drawn to it, and despite every logical thought in her mind telling her to leave it alone, she couldn't. The mirror held her captive. Hours later, Elena sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the mirror, almost hypnotized by the shifting shadows. Her reflection was normal, but every now and then, she could see the figure in the corner of the room in the glass. The woman's hollow eyes were always locked on her, as though she knew Elena was watching. Elena felt her eyelids growing heavy, her body aching from the exhaustion of the day. She needed sleep, but she couldn't tear herself away from the mirror. She had to see what would happen next. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The woman was standing now, much closer than before, and she was smiling. A slow, sinister grin that stretched unnaturally wide. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her heart leaping into her throat. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. Before she could move, the lights in the room flickered. The temperature dropped, and for a brief moment, everything went completely dark. And then asterisk suddenly, the woman in the reflection was standing behind Elena in the real world. Elena's heart raced as she stood frozen, staring into the mirror. The woman in the reflection was no longer confined to the far corner. Her face was now only inches away from Elena's own, staring directly at her with hollow eyes. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. The reflection was impossible, unnatural. The woman's smile had stretched too wide, too unnaturally, her lips curling in a way no human face could ever do. It was as if the very act of smiling had torn her face apart. Elena spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears, but the room behind her was empty. The air was cold, unnervingly so, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, wrapping themselves around her like unseen hands. She turned back to the mirror, her body trembling. The reflection was still the same. The woman's smile had faded, but her eyes, those wide, empty eyes, were still fixed on Elena. She didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there in the reflection, silent, watching. Elena took a step back, her body instinctively wanting to distance itself from the glass. She couldn't understand what was happening. The mirror, it wasn't just showing her reflection, was it? It was showing something else, something alive. Her thoughts raced. Was it some kind of trick? A faulty mirror with some weird illusion built into it? Or was there something more sinister at play here? The woman's eyes followed her every movement in the reflection, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it was no coincidence. It was as if the woman knew exactly what she was thinking, every fear, every doubt. It was impossible, but there was no other explanation. Taking a deep breath, Elena forced herself to look away from the mirror, determined to break whatever strange hold it had over her. She walked to the kitchen, but as she did, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the mirror. The woman was still there, watching. Elena slammed the kitchen cabinet door shut, trying to shake the panic that had started to creep into her mind. "It's just a reflection," she whispered, trying to convince herself. "It's just a reflection. There's nothing in the glass." But as soon as the words left her lips, the air in the apartment shifted. A low hum filled the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was a sound that felt wrong, like it didn't belong to this world. The lights flickered again. Elena froze. Her body stiffened as the lights blinked on and off, casting strange, stuttering shadows across the room. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, too loud, too fast, but she couldn't stop it. And then, the reflection in the mirror shifted once more. She didn't want to look. She didn't, but her body betrayed her. Slowly, almost involuntarily, her eyes turned back to the glass. The woman was gone, but there was something else. A shape, dark, jagged, and looming. It towered behind Elena in the mirror, its form shifting and flickering like smoke caught in the wind. The figure didn't have a clear outline, but its presence was undeniable. It was tall, menacing, and its dark form seemed to stretch further into the reflection with each passing second. The hum from earlier grew louder now, the sound vibrating in her chest. It felt like the walls were closing in around her. Suddenly, the reflection of the dark figure in the mirror moved. Not like a reflection should. Not in perfect synchrony with Elena's own movements. No, this was different. The figure in the mirror moved on its own, stepping closer to the edge of the glass, its form growing clearer with every step it took. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to run, to do something, but she couldn't. It was as if the mirror was holding her in place, forcing her to watch as the shadow approached. The figure in the reflection, if it could even be called that, stopped just behind Elena. Its dark presence loomed, and its eyes, it had eyes now. Elena gasped, her chest constricting in terror as she saw the eyes. They were empty, black voids, as if there were nothing inside. The figure wasn't just some phantom. It was alive, and it was staring at her. "Get away from the mirror," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. But the figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It knew she was watching. It knew she couldn't escape. Her legs felt like jelly, but somehow, Elena managed to take a shaky step backward. The figure in the mirror mirrored her movement, never losing sight of her. In an instant, the reflection shifted. The dark figure was no longer standing behind her. It was now right beside her, its cold presence pressing against her, as though it were standing directly next to her in the real world. She reached out instinctively, her hand grazing the surface of the mirror. But the moment her fingers touched the glass, the world around her seemed to distort, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of whatever was on the other side. A sharp chill crawled up her spine as she felt a sudden tug. The mirror, it wasn't just showing her things. It was pulling at her, drawing her in, as if it wanted her to cross into the other side. Elena yanked her hand away, stumbling back into the living room. Her heart was pounding in her chest. This wasn't just some reflection. The mirror wasn't a mirror anymore. It was something far darker, something that shouldn't exist. The hum was growing louder, the shadows in the room darker, and now Elena could hear something. A voice, faint at first, but growing louder, clearer with each passing moment. "Come closer," it whispered, a voice low and guttural, as if the words were coming from the depths of the earth itself. Come closer. Her stomach lurched as the voice echoed around the apartment. It wasn't her own mind playing tricks on her. The voice was real. It was coming from the mirror. Without thinking, Elena ran, her breath coming in quick gasps as she reached the door. She yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind her. Her heart was racing, her thoughts scattered, but one thing was clear. She had to get away from that mirror. And yet, as she stood there in the hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't just in her apartment. It was with her. It was watching. It was waiting. Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay wide-eyed in the bed, her body tense, her mind replaying every horrific moment she had experienced in the apartment. The shadows in her room seemed deeper now, as if the darkness itself had grown, filling the corners with an unsettling weight. She could still hear the voice from the mirror. Come closer. Come closer. Each time she closed her eyes, the voice echoed in her mind. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but the more she tried to block it out, the louder it became, until it felt as though it was right next to her ear, a cold breath on her skin. The thought of returning to the apartment filled her with dread, but she knew she had to. The mirror, the figure, the voices, the thought of it made her stomach churn. But something deep inside her knew she couldn't simply run away. The mirror was calling her. Somehow, she had to understand what was happening before it consumed her. As dawn's first light filtered through the window, Elena pushed herself out of bed. Her body felt stiff, drained, as though she hadn't rested at all. The haunting image of the shadowy figure still loomed in her mind. The reflection, the one that didn't match reality, had to be connected to everything. But how? And why? Grabbing her coat, Elena left her apartment, the air outside sharp against her skin. The sun was still hidden behind the clouds, casting a dull, gray light over the streets. There was something off about the world around her, like everything was moving just a little slower than it should, as if it, too, was caught in the grasp of the mirror's malevolent power. She made her way to the antique store where she had purchased the mirror. The bell above the door rang as she entered, the sound sharp and almost unnatural. The place smelled of dust and old wood, a familiar scent, but it only added to the oppressive feeling that hung in the air. The shopkeeper, an older man with thinning white hair, looked up from behind the counter when she entered. His eyes flicked over her, recognizing her immediately, but there was no warmth in his gaze. You came back. His voice was calm, almost as if he expected it. I have to know more, Elena said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound confident. That mirror, it's not just a mirror. Something's happening. Something's wrong. The man said nothing at first. He simply stared at her with those piercing eyes, as if weighing her words. Elena shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, feeling a sense of unease creeping over her once again. She had a feeling he knew more than he was letting on. He had to. The mirror is special, the shopkeeper said, finally breaking the silence. It's old and it's connected to things. Not everything is as it seems. What do you mean? Elena pressed, her heart racing. The man didn't respond right away, instead walking slowly over to a shelf filled with various antiques. He ran his hand over one of the items, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Mirrors, he finally spoke, are more than just glass and metal. They reflect not just what's in front of them, but what could be, or what should be. They can distort reality, twist time. People have been using mirrors for centuries to peer into other realms, to glimpse things that are hidden. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Other realms? The shopkeeper turned to face her, his expression grave. Yes, mirrors can act as gateways, portals. If one isn't careful, They can open doors to places we weren't meant to see. And sometimes those doors don't close. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of his words sank in. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of reality. It was showing her something else. A wrong reality. A place where shadows moved on their own. Where figures crossed over from one side to the other. "What can I do?" Elena asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "How do I stop it?" The shopkeeper's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You can't stop it. Not once it's been awakened." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "It's too late," he said. "The mirror has chosen you. It has connected itself to you. The more you resist, the stronger its hold will become." Elena recoiled, her chest tightening. "What happens to me if I can't stop it?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "The mirror will keep pulling you in, little by little, until it takes everything. Your mind, your soul, until you are lost to it, and it is all that remains." The words felt like ice in her veins. She had to get away from the mirror. But how could she? It had already latched onto her. It wasn't just some haunted object. It was a force, and it had its claws in her, ready to drag her into the darkness. She backed away from the counter, her thoughts spinning in a frenzy. But before she could say another word, the shopkeeper spoke again, his voice colder than before. "There is one thing you can try," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But be warned, it's dangerous, and it may not work." Elena's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "The mirror can be broken," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you'll have to face what it's holding on the other side. If you're strong enough, you can shatter it. But be careful. Once you break the glass, whatever is on the other side will be free. And it may come after you." Elena's mind raced. Break the mirror? Face whatever was waiting on the other side. The thought was terrifying, but the alternative was far worse. She had no choice. "Where do I find it?" she asked, her voice determined now. The shopkeeper hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice low and solemn. "You already have it, the mirror, but you'll need to act quickly. Time is running out. If you wait too long, the mirror will become more powerful, and it will be too late." Elena turned to leave, but the man stopped her with one final warning. "Remember, once you break it, there's no turning back." Elena barely heard him. Her mind was already consumed by the image of the mirror, of the figure, of the darkness pressing in from every side. She had no time to waste. As she walked back to her apartment, she felt a strange sensation creeping over her. It was as though the shadows themselves were reaching for her, pulling at her, whispering her name. And when she finally stepped inside her apartment, the mirror was waiting, silent, patient. But this time, the reflection was different. The figure wasn't standing in the corner anymore. It was right in front of her. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked onto the mirror's reflection. The figure wasn't just in front of her anymore. It was moving. Slowly, it began to reach out toward her, its fingers stretching toward the glass as though it wanted to escape, to crawl out and into her world. The reflection was distorted, twisting, and warping in unnatural ways. The air around her felt colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself had grown, taking on a life of its own. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew she should run. She knew she should turn away and leave, but her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body unwilling to move. It was as if the mirror had a hold on her, drawing her in with an invisible force. She couldn't look away, and for some reason she didn't want to. The figure in the mirror, no, it was more than just a figure, was changing. Its features were indistinct, shifting like smoke in a windstorm. The shape of it was humanoid, but the longer she stared, the less human it became. Its limbs were too long, too thin. Its head, too large, tilted unnaturally to the side. And its eyes, those eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to stare straight through her. Elena's pulse quickened. The shopkeeper's warning echoed in her mind. Once you break it, there's no turning back. She didn't know what the figure in the mirror was, but she knew it was more than just a trick of the light. It was real, and if she didn't do something soon, it might find a way into her world. I have to break it. The thought was like a whisper in her mind, almost a command, urging her to act. She didn't want to, but she knew there was no other choice. She had to stop whatever this was before it was too late. But even as she thought it, the reflection in the mirror began to shift again. This time, it wasn't just moving. It was speaking. The lips of the figure curled into something that resembled a smile, if a smile could be called that. It was wide, too wide, stretching almost impossibly across its face, and its teeth gleamed sharp and jagged. Come closer. The words weren't spoken aloud, but they were there, in her mind, like a whisper of ice on her skin. Elena stumbled back, her body recoiling from the mirror. Her legs felt weak, her heart racing in her chest. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was something more, something that had crossed over into her world. Don't look away, the voice urged, softer now, more insistent. Elena's head spun. She didn't know if she could trust herself anymore. She had to break it, but the reflection was calling to her, its black eyes pleading in a way that twisted something deep inside her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away as possible. But every time she moved, her feet seemed to carry her back toward the mirror. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows growing darker. The figure in the mirror started moving again, this time more rapidly, its limbs jerking in unnatural angles as it inched closer to the glass. Elena's eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening. It was coming for her. Her body moved without thinking. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and threw it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the sound ringing in her ears. For a moment, everything was still. Then the reflection moved. It wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was inside the room. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the shattered pieces of glass on the floor began to move. The reflections, still distorted, shifted and danced across the fragments. She could see the figure's twisted form reflected in the shards, each piece showing a different angle, a different part of its body. And then, without warning, the reflection began to reach out from the shards, the figure crawling out of the broken glass. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure in the mirror was no longer a mere reflection. It was real, and it was coming for her. Elena ran. Her footsteps echoed down the hall as she rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the handle. She could hear the figure moving behind her, its limbs scraping against the walls, its breathing slow and heavy. The air around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though the very space was closing in on her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was run. Finally, she reached the door and threw it open, slamming it shut behind her. The figure's form appeared for a split second in the doorway, its black eyes glaring at her, but then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door, her mind racing. What was that thing? Her thoughts spun in a whirlwind. She couldn't make sense of it. The mirror had broken, but the creature, it wasn't gone. It had followed her, and worse, it was still connected to her. It had to be. A sharp knock at the door broke through her thoughts. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Who is it? She whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The knocking continued, each bang louder than the last, as though something or someone was trying to get in. Elena's pulse raced. She had to act, but what could she do? She couldn't escape it. Not now, not ever. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Complete silence filled the apartment. But then, from behind her, she heard a soft, raspy breath. Elena turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway of her bedroom, she saw the figure again. This time, it wasn't in the mirror. It was right there, in her room, its twisted form standing tall and still, its eyes locked on hers. And then it spoke. "I told you to come closer." Elena's breath was caught in her throat as the figure in her room loomed before her. Its twisted, elongated form barely seemed to fit in the space, as though it were too large for the world it had entered. The air was thick with a presence that she could feel in every part of her being, a suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. Its eyes, those eyes, burned into hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl, pulling her gaze as though it were a magnet. She took a hesitant step back, her heart hammering in her ears. The creature's smile twisted wider, impossibly wide, stretching across its face in an unholy grin. Its teeth glistened like shards of broken glass, jagged and sharp, and its eyes glowed with a dim, otherworldly light. "You shouldn't have looked," it hissed in a voice that was both hollow and heavy, as if it came from the depths of a nightmare. The words felt like a physical force, pushing against her chest, urging her to step back even further. But she couldn't move. Her body refused to obey. What is this thing? Elena's mind screamed, but she couldn't find an answer. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It wasn't just a figment of the mirror. This was something else. Something ancient. Something evil. She blinked, her vision becoming blurry with tears. And in that brief moment of vulnerability, the creature's head tilted, its neck creaking unnaturally as it leaned forward. "You shouldn't have bought the mirror," it rasped. "Now, you'll never escape." A cold chill ran through her spine as the words sank in. Escape, the mirror, the reflection. Everything had been tied to that damned object. It was supposed to be an antique, a relic, but now it felt like a curse, one that had bound her to this creature. This thing that was slowly crawling its way into her life, piece by piece. Elena's hands trembled as she backed away again, but the creature did not move. It didn't need to. It simply stared, waiting, its eyes never leaving hers. Her mind raced. She had to think. She had to find a way out. She couldn't face this thing alone. As she stumbled backward, Elena's foot caught on the edge of a chair, and she fell to the floor with a harsh thud. The creature's laugh, low, guttural, echoed through the room, sending a shock of terror through her body. The sound of it twisted something inside her, a horrible knot tightening in her stomach. For a moment, everything was still. The creature didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared. Then, slowly, as though savoring the moment, it lifted one long, bony arm and pointed directly at her. Its finger was unnaturally long, the joints bending at sickening angles. The room seemed to darken further, the shadows pressing in as if they, too, were drawn to its outstretched hand. "Your fate is already sealed," it whispered, the words coming out like a breath of frost. "There is no escape now." Elena's mind raced. No escape. The words repeated over and over again, a haunting mantra. But then, something flickered in her mind. The mirror. It had started all of this. Maybe it could end it too. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet and turned toward the door. She had to get out of this room. She had to find a way to destroy the mirror, to sever whatever connection it had to this nightmare. Her hand flew to the door handle, but before she could turn it, She heard it, the faintest sound coming from behind her, the soft scraping of something moving, sliding against the floor. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned slowly, dreading what she might see. The creature's reflection was still there, hovering in the doorway, waiting. No, not the reflection. It was stepping through the door, slowly but surely, its body creaking and twisting as it entered her world. The very air seemed to shift, growing denser, heavier. The walls groaned, and the light in the room flickered, as though the very space was struggling to hold it in. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had no time left. She spun and yanked open the door. Without thinking, she dashed down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. The creature's laugh echoed after her, a hollow, oppressive sound that seemed to chase her. Each footstep it took amplifying the terror in her chest. She didn't know where she was going. She just had to get away. She had to escape. But as she ran, she noticed something strange. The hallway, which should have led to the front door of her apartment, seemed longer, darker, more oppressive than before. The walls seemed to close in around her, as though the very structure of the building had changed. The shadows in the corners of the hall deepened, stretching further, twisting, and curling like tendrils reaching out for her. She turned a corner, and there it was again, the mirror. The same damn mirror. It stood at the end of the hall, just as it had when she first brought it into the apartment. But now it was different. The reflection was no longer just a reflection, it was alive. The figure in the mirror was standing right there, staring back at her. But it wasn't just staring, it was moving. Its arms began to extend toward her through the glass, reaching out with long, elongated fingers. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had to get out of there. There was no time. She couldn't fight this thing. It was too powerful, too connected to the mirror, and she couldn't risk it coming for her again. With a surge of panic, Elena sprinted past the mirror, her body tingling with fear as she felt its eyes on her. She didn't stop until she reached the end of the hall, where the door to the stairs was. Her hands shook as she grabbed the handle and yanked it open. But as soon as she stepped onto the staircase, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door behind her slammed shut with a force so powerful it shook the building. Elena's heart jumped into her throat as she turned slowly, looking back down the dark hallway. The mirror had followed her, and it was waiting. Elena stood frozen on the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest as the door to the hallway slammed shut behind her. The sound reverberated through the building like a thunderclap, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. She could feel the sweat on her palms, the cold air nipping at her skin. She didn't dare to move, didn't dare to turn around to face the horror that was waiting for her. But she knew it was there. She could feel its presence, like a shadow lurking just out of sight, its eyes watching her from the other side of the door. The mirror, the reflection, they were not separate entities anymore. It was one and the same, bound to her, connected in ways she couldn't understand. She forced herself to move, her legs trembling as she descended the stairs slowly, each step like a pounding drumbeat in her ears. She had to get out. She had to escape. But where? The apartment, the entire building, felt like it was closing in on her. Every shadow seemed to stretch further. The walls felt tighter, and the air grew colder with each passing second. The front door was just ahead. She could see it, its silhouette barely visible through the frosted glass. It felt so close, yet so impossibly far away. The closer she got to it, the more the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, as though they were trying to pull her back into the darkness. No, don't look back. Just keep going. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She had to turn around. She had to know if it was following her. Slowly, almost against her will, Elena glanced over her shoulder, dreading what she might see. The reflection was there, the mirror, but now it wasn't just standing in the hallway. It had shifted. It was no longer in its original place. It had moved, like it had come to life, pulling itself closer to her. The figure stood within the mirror, its body rippling like a distortion in the glass. Its face twisted into that grotesque, smiling expression, the same unholy grin from before. And its eyes, they glowed with a sickly yellow light burning into her soul. It was no longer confined to the reflection. It was reaching out. For a brief, fleeting moment, Elena thought she saw its hand move, the long, bony fingers stretching toward her. She blinked, and in that split second, the figure was no longer just a reflection. It was here. The glass of the mirror seemed to ripple like water, and for a split second, Elena saw herself in it. Standing right there, terrified, her face pale with shock. But then she saw something more. A dark shape moving behind her, lurking just out of view. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a mirror anymore. It wasn't just a reflection. It had become a portal. A flash of movement behind her made her freeze. She whipped around to find the source of the sound, but the hallway was empty. The darkness seemed to swallow everything in sight, the light from the stairwell barely reaching the farthest corners. But she wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible, drifted through the air. "It's not too late, Elena. Come back to me." Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of the thing in the mirror. She could hear it in her bones, deep in her skull. It had followed her. It was here, in this world now, not just in the reflection. Elena's breath hitched, and her eyes darted back to the stairs. She had to get out. She had to find a way to break the connection. But how? How could she escape when the very walls of the building were turning against her? Another whisper, this time louder, clearer. "You can't run. You can't hide. It's too late." She bolted for the front door. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She just ran. Her heart raced, her legs feeling like lead, but she pushed herself harder. The door was almost within reach, just a few more steps. But as she reached for the handle, it felt as though the air around her thickened, like the very atmosphere was being suffocated by an unseen force. Her hand hovered just inches from the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. Panicking, Elena jerked the handle, yanking it with all her strength. But it was as though something was holding it shut, something stronger than her, something that didn't want her to leave. The air felt suffocating, as though the very room was pressing against her chest, forcing her to stay. She turned toward the mirror again, her eyes locking onto the creature's reflection. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was walking toward her, its form blurring in the glass, but its eyes, those eyes, were still locked on her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room, ringing in her ears. "You belong to me now, Elena. You're mine." Elena's fingers scrambled desperately at the doorknob, but it was useless. The door refused to open. The creature's reflection was growing closer, its fingers sliding out of the mirror, elongating toward her. The glass distorted around it like it was melting, warping, bending to the will of the thing within. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door burst open with a force that shook the entire room. Elena stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat, her body trembling from head to toe. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, but the hallway was empty. The mirror, however, remained. Standing in the doorway, its reflection still staring back at her with that twisted grin. But now, there was something more, something new. The creature's hand was no longer confined to the mirror. It was in the room with her. Elena's heart skipped a beat. her breath coming in shallow gasps as the reflection in the mirror began to stretch beyond the boundaries of the glass. The hand, those long, twisted fingers, were no longer confined to the mirror. They were real, reaching out toward her with a slow, deliberate motion. A wave of terror washed over her, but it wasn't just fear that gripped her now. It was something far worse. The cold realization that she wasn't going to escape this. The door was wide open, but it was as though the room itself had become a trap. No matter where she turned, the creature was right there, waiting for her, its presence suffocating and all-consuming. With trembling hands, Elena took a step back, her eyes locked on the mirror, unwilling to tear her gaze away from the horrifying scene unfolding in front of her. The fingers, long and skeletal, stretched further and further until they seemed to reach beyond the frame, hanging in midair like the claws of some nightmarish beast. She could see them in her peripheral vision, too, as though they were everywhere, lingering in the shadows, inching closer. The reflection of the creature seemed to grow, expanding, distorting, until Elena realized that what she was seeing wasn't just a mirror anymore. It had become a portal, a doorway into another world, one where the boundaries between reality and nightmare were blurred beyond recognition. She could hear it now, the creature's breath, thick and ragged, filling the room with a low, guttural growl that made her skin crawl. The voice from the mirror echoed in her mind again, deeper now, more menacing. "You can't escape, Elena. You belong to me, forever." She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet, her heart racing as the creature's clawed hand reached out, grazing the edge of her sleeve. It was real. It was here. The glass of the mirror seemed to ripple, warping like liquid, and for a moment, Elena saw something, someone, standing behind the creature. Another figure, shadowed and indistinct, watching her with cold, dead eyes. She couldn't make out the face, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming, suffocating her. And then the voice came again, louder this time, a rasping hiss that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "She's coming for you. She'll take you from me." Elena felt the floor beneath her feet tremble as though something was shifting in the walls, something ancient and malevolent. The air felt thick and heavy, and the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on her. There was no escape. She was trapped. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. She couldn't fight it, she knew that. There was no way to stop the mirror from taking her, from dragging her into whatever twisted world it had created. But she had to try. She had to do something. Anything. Without thinking, Elena turned and ran. She didn't look back. She didn't dare to glance at the mirror again. Her feet pounded against the floor as she sprinted down the hallway, her mind racing with fear, panic clawing at her chest. She could feel the creature's presence behind her, its eyes on her back, watching her every move. But when she reached the staircase and turned to descend, she froze. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was a figure, a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide and vacant, staring up at Elena as if she had been waiting for her. The woman was dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair long and matted, hanging in front of her face like a veil. Elena's blood ran cold. She knew who this woman was. She had seen her in the mirror, the woman in the reflection. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. The woman didn't move, but Elena could feel the heavy weight of her gaze, as though she was being pulled toward her. The whispers grew louder, filling her head, repeating over and over again. "You can't run from her. She's already here." The woman's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and Elena took an instinctive step backward, her heart pounding in her ears. But the figure didn't step forward. She didn't need to. The very air between them seemed to warp, like the space itself was bending, folding inward, pulling Elena toward her. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. The figure was everywhere now, her face reflected in every corner of the room, in every shadow, in every piece of glass. Elena's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching at the cold, hard surface as though trying to hold on to reality. She had to get out. She had to. A sudden crash echoed through the room, followed by a sharp, bone-chilling scream. Elena's head snapped up, her heart in her throat. The mirror, it was shattered, but it wasn't just the glass that had broken. The creature from the reflection was coming through. Its form was more solid now, emerging from the jagged shards of the mirror. Its face twisted in an expression of pure malice, its mouth open wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. It was larger now, more monstrous, a creature of darkness and shadow that had slipped from the confines of the glass and into the real world. Elena screamed, but the sound was caught in her throat, stifled by the sheer terror that washed over her. The thing, no, the beast, loomed over her, its eyes burning with hunger. She tried to move, to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. Her limbs felt frozen, numb with fear. The creature's claws stretched toward her, the air around it crackling with a malevolent energy. And then, just as it was about to strike, a blinding light flashed, momentarily illuminating the entire room. Elena shielded her eyes, her breath caught in her chest, but the light didn't last. It was gone, leaving only the deep silence that followed. When she opened her eyes again, the creature was gone. The room was silent, empty. Elena was alone, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It was far from over. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena remained on the floor, her hands shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light from the shattered mirror had vanished, but the air still crackled with an unsettling energy, as if the world around her hadn't quite returned to normal. She dared not move, afraid that any sudden motion might bring the creature back. The image of its monstrous, clawed hand reaching for her was burned into her mind, and she could feel the lingering presence of its dark, malevolent gaze. It was as though it had never left, like it was still here, hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike. For several long moments, Elena stayed still, listening for any sound, any hint that the nightmare was over. But all she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, with trembling hands, she slowly pushed herself off the floor and stood. Her legs were weak beneath her, but she had to keep moving. She had to get out of this apartment, away from the mirror, away from whatever was haunting her. She glanced at the broken mirror, its shards scattered across the floor like jagged teeth, reflecting 1,000 distorted versions of herself. But there was nothing more in the glass, nothing but the empty, fractured surface. Maybe it's finally over, she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. Maybe it's all just a nightmare, but deep down she knew better. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was a gateway, a portal to something darker, something ancient. And the creature, whatever it was, had already marked her. Elena moved cautiously toward the door, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. She reached out for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, a soft, echoing voice filled the room. Elena! The sound of her name was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it reverberated through the walls, chilling her to the bone. You can't leave. Not now. Not ever. Elena spun around, her eyes wide with terror. There, in the corner of the room, a dark figure stood. It was a silhouette, its shape barely distinguishable in the shadows. But she knew that it was the same creature from the mirror, the one that had haunted her for so long. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, burning with an otherworldly intensity, and its voice, a low, guttural growl, rumbled through the room. "You belong to me, Elena. You always have." She backed away, panic surging through her veins, but there was nowhere to run. The door was locked. The window was too high to reach. She was trapped. The creature took a step forward, its form shifting, becoming more defined, more real with every passing second. It was huge, towering over her, its monstrous features more grotesque than anything she could have imagined. Its skin was dark and slick, its muscles bulging and twisted in unnatural ways, and its mouth was a cavernous, gaping hole, dripping with a viscous, black substance. Elena could feel its breath on her skin, hot and fetid, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was tight, her limbs frozen in place by the sheer terror of it all. "You should have never taken the mirror," the creature hissed. "Now you'll be mine forever, just like the others before you." Suddenly, the air around her seemed to shift, warping, bending, as if reality itself was tearing apart at the seams. The room began to distort, its walls stretching and contracting like some twisted funhouse, and Elena felt her feet lift off the ground. It was pulling her in. The mirror, the portal, was opening again. Her vision blurred, her senses overwhelmed by the darkness, the pull of the creature's power. And then, just as it seemed like she would be swallowed whole, she heard a sound, a faint tapping. At first, Elena thought it was her mind playing tricks on her. But then it came again, faint, rhythmic, like someone knocking on the door. "What?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. And then, in a blur, the door flew open with a force that knocked it off its hinges. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, his eyes wide with alarm as he looked around the room. He took one step into the apartment, his gaze immediately falling on Elena. "Elena!" he called, his voice desperate. "Get away from it!" The creature hissed, its form contorting in rage. It lunged forward, but before it could reach her, the man raised his hand. A flash of bright light erupted from his palm, blinding Elena for a moment. When she could see again, the creature was gone. The man was standing in front of her, his body glowing faintly with the same eerie light. He looked back at her, his expression grim but determined. "You're not alone," he said, his voice soft but filled with authority. "I've been watching. I know what's been happening, and I can help you stop it." Elena's mind raced, confusion and fear colliding in her thoughts. "Who are you? What is this? What happened to the creature?" The man sighed, his gaze turning to the shattered mirror. "That thing is a manifestation of the curse that binds this place. It's been here for centuries, feeding on the fear of anyone who comes too close." He stepped forward, offering her a hand. "We don't have much time. You've uncovered the mirror's secret, and now it's after you. But I can help you close the door. You just have to trust me." Elena hesitated for a moment, her heart still pounding in her chest, but something in the man's eyes, something in his calm, unwavering presence, told her that he was telling the truth. She took his hand, and as soon as she did, the room seemed to return to normal. The walls stopped shifting, the air grew still, and the heavy weight of the creature's presence lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elena could breathe again. But as the man led her toward the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over, that the darkness wasn't done with her yet.